Hello, everybody, and welcome to the Ethicsverse. A shout out to all our Ethicuties out there. Thanks for being at the coolest place to be at noon Eastern every Thursday. We're going to jump in today. We have a great show for you on a topic that's close to my heart. And I think for a lot of you in the audience, it's something that we're all realizing is more prevalent, more important, and an increasingly key component of driving inclusivity and compliance in your culture of ethics. We're going to be talking about neurodivergence today. So let's jump in here. We're going to be talking about leadership and culture in a neurodivergent world. So if you haven't been paying attention, we live in a neurodivergent world. And I'm excited to talk about this because I've been advocating to our team for years to do a topic on this because I think it's so important. I think it's underrepresented, doesn't get enough attention. And it's important to note that if you're neurodivergent, I am too, and we all deserve to be properly represented and supported in our workplaces. And we're going to be talking today not just about this issue and what it means, but also how it can affect and impact the way that you run your compliance program to manage risk and drive a culture of ethics across your organization. Jump in with those emojis. I didn't have breakfast today, so I'm feeling pretty hungry, and you know we love to eat up those emojis. So jump in the chat. Feedback is a gift, so give a gift to your second favorite host of the Ethicsverse by clicking or by getting this QR code or clicking the link that's in the console and give us some feedback on how this Ethicsverse went. This is your show. This is for you to drive value to you and your team. So give us some feedback so we can keep making great shows for you. As we move along here, we got a couple of announcements. Help us help you. If you were here last week with this survey around leadership in compliance that we partnered with FTI on, is something that we need your feedback on, and we need your input so that we can get a better idea of what leadership and compliance looks like this year. And for filling out the survey, you'll get quick access to that report when it comes out. We love learning here, so let's learn. Check out our social media, our podcasts, and the books in the Ethicsverse library for things that are hand-selected and thumbs-up verified for helping you build a better career and a better culture of compliance. There's a quick QR code for you. If you got your phone out, grab that. And all of these links are in the console for you, so if you miss them, you can grab them there. And our team's great at throwing them in the chat for you if you want it that way as well. You better be subscribed to the Ethics Experts, guys, because only if you're subscribed to the Ethics Experts do you get that extra special welcome at the start of each episode. This episode with Tobias Thorisson was really great about talking about culture, about talking about how bad cultures can take on a life of their own and be really destructive, and about understanding the culture of cults and destructive cultures can help you build a strong and intentional culture in your workplace. FCPA Survival Guide, winning massive awards around the world. The W3 Award for Tom Fox, featuring Nick Gallo and a bunch of other great guests. Check out the written content or the podcast on the FCPA Survival Guide. If you don't know, middle managers might be the key to improving the ROI and effectiveness of your program. You might be getting 1, maybe 2 reports per 100 employees per year. And each of those employees is 6 to 8 times more likely to bring something to their middle manager. So people are loving this toolkit, a bunch of easy to use, applicable content and resources for you to download and accelerate your work to engage middle managers in being advocates and being bought into your compliance program. Check out the ecosystem. It's the best place. This is our Ethico software for driving a culture of compliance, winning a bunch of awards around G2. People love it. We got a little testimonial here. And what we're doing, because we love you so much, is we're offering up to 1 year free for people who adopt a new service on the ecosystem to help you manage that transition, manage your budget, and get into an upgrade. Upgrading your software is going to upgrade your life, your professional success, and your program of compliance. I am super excited about this new book from our dear friend, Hema Lomax, The Art of Ideation for Culture Building. This is an awesome book. You got to check it out. It's hot off the presses. And part of what we do, because we love you and we love learning, is we're giving away, you thought it was 5, no, double it, 10. 10 books we're giving away for people who, here's what you got to do. We got a new challenge for you. Post on LinkedIn or on socials about the Ethicsverse, one of your takeaways that you enjoyed it. Invite people to join you next week. Give us a post, #Ethicsverse and @MentionEthico, and you'll be entered in the sweepstakes to win up to 10 books. This is your best chance at getting a free book from Ethico all month long. So check it out. Do that post. tag Ethico and hashtag Ethicsverse for your chance to win this amazing book. You're going to love this book. It's going to make your quarter. Not 5, it's going to be 10 because that's how we're doing it. Like I said, a year of free service, and I'll pass it over to you. This Matt Kelly. Take us away, Matt.
Sure thing. So hello, everybody, and thank you for joining us again this week for the Ethicsverse session. As Gio said, we are here to talk today about neurodivergence in the workforce. What do we mean when we say that term? What are the compliance risks that might come up with having neurodivergent workers on your workforce? How do you think about that? How do you handle it? And joining us to discuss that, well, first we do have Gio, who is looking as cyborg as ever. Thank you to the AI filters. But we also have Jason Meyer. So Jason is nowadays president of Lead Good Education, which is a consulting firm that helps companies think about these issues. He is the founder and principal lawyer at Princeton Business Law, which is in New Jersey, where Jason is from. Jason is also a longtime compliance professional. So, Jason, first, welcome. Thank you for being here today.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Gio. Good to see you. Get well. Shout out to Nick.
And for everybody who is listening, as always, we want this session to be as useful for you as possible. So I have a bunch of questions that I'm going to put to Jason and Gio, but if you have questions, pop them into the chat or submit them by Q&A, and we will try and weave those into discussion as quickly as we can. Jason, I'm going to start with a broad question to you just about what we mean when we talk about neurodivergence. Most people will automatically assume that's autism or ADD. I am assuming that the definition is actually broader than that. But also, I wanted to tack on one little twist. Is there any difference between neurodivergence and people who have mental health issues, which also needs attention, and we can get to that as necessary too. But do people conflate these terms? Are they different things? What does neurodivergence mean? Like, lay the landscape for us.
Yeah, and thank you, Matt. And I think part of it is none of these definitions to me are precise. They're all sort of there for convenience, and they're sort of growing and morphing a bit to fit the conversation as the conversation advances. Here's what I think of the terms and how I think, really based on what I think of as common usage, at least at the moment. So neurodiversity is us. It's humans. It's our species, right? We have evolved to all think and process information differently. We evolved that way because it helped us survive. That some people thought and processed information in a different way than other people did, and that across the species we do that differently. Neurodivergence, to me, is really a term of convenience. It's a catch-all for people with a variety of traits that have labels, that we have attached labels to. Traits, yes, like autism or autistic traits, ADHD or ADD, that is some attentional issue. I think it includes people who have executive function differences, dyslexia, dyscalculia, a variety of other things that basically means, again, you think and process information in a different way. I used to sort of describe humanity having a bell curve of the way we thought and processed information, and you could think of neurodivergence as being on the outside, but there's actually an analogy used that I prefer, which is to think of like an audio mixing board. Like, think of the DJ, think of the radio, the guy behind a radio console, all of these knobs that can be turned. And if one of those is attention, and one of those is, reading ability, and one of them is executive function, so forth and so on. We all have our dials set in a different place. And if we're among those whose dials are more different than others, then I think it's fair to call that neurodivergence. In terms of its relation to mental health issues, I think that there are both commonalities and differences. I think one difference is neurodivergence tends to be used for, I was born this way. This is the way I think. It's the way I'm wired. It's the way I've always been wired. But there are a number of conditions that we might think of as mental health issues, OCD, PTSD sometimes, where frankly, the way I am dealing with the workplace is not going to really present that differently than if I was more classically neurodivergent, which is a way, I think, of saying, if we do the things in our organizations that make our organizations more neuro-inclusive, more neuro-friendly, then while we are benefiting the neurodivergent population, we may also be benefiting a lot of the population sort of struggling with mental health issues at the moment. And there is a theme throughout being neuro-inclusive, which is doing things that are critical for some, but beneficial for all. And in fact, a lot of what we might do to be more neuro-inclusive is just going to be better for the whole population.
Yeah,
Well,
and I think it's really interesting to get this concept right, because, I think that maybe it's an old view, or maybe it's something that we're working against. When we're speaking about neurodivergence, we're not just simply speaking about somebody who has a clinical diagnosis of, one of these specific neurodivergent traits. These are people who the way our minds work are different from, what has been classically held as the standard way of working. And it covers a wide range of issues. So these are people who are prone to anxiety. This includes Tourette syndrome and dyslexia. Are people who have time blindness, or are, have trouble with time management or executive function. There are things around sensory issues. And there are a lot of things that, we want to balance, painting this in broad strokes, with understanding that these are specific actions and ways that our brains work, that can make it more difficult if there's not consideration given in your culture, in your policies, and in your compliance program. And I think it's really essential to note here that this category of neurodivergence is not a disorder. This is not something that we should, be putting people in a box in and assuming that they can't do their job. A lot of these things, like, hyperfocus, can be an absolute asset to somebody's job. And a lot of these things can drive more creative thinking, and they can be benefits to our workplace. And, in our concepts of diversity and inclusivity, I think it's really important for us as leaders to include this concept of neurodivergence, which is harder to see walking down the hallway than the diversity issue of race, but absolutely essential for us to cater our programs to, and to making sure that those employees not only feel welcome, but are supported in their personal and professional success.
So why?
I mean,
go ahead, Jay.
When we talk about diversity, right, the line is always, well, if we have a diverse workforce, then we'll be able to solve problems. We'll have different perspective to solve problems. When you talk about the neurodivergent population, you're literally talking about people who will solve problems differently. They will approach the problem in a different way. So bang on, Gio.
Why are we talking about this today as opposed to 15 years ago or 15 years in the future? Has neurodivergence hit a critical mass in the workforce? Have compliance risks suddenly bumped up against neurodivergence that has always been there? We haven't actually talked about roughly how many people in the workforce might be neurodivergent. So, Jason, give us some of the why here and now, and how big is this dimension to the issue?
Yeah, and let's start with the how big, and then maybe why we're seeing it that way. To me, I mean, we've looked at the numbers in the initiatives that my companies have been leading, and conservatively, the number of neurodivergent individuals in the workforce is at least 20%, and I think quite a bit higher than that. When you add up the amount of the population that's thought of as being, having attention deficit issues, the population that's thought of as having autistic traits, and so forth, you get up over 20% in a big hurry. And the numbers have been increasing. The prevalence of autism under the CDC's count is up by a percentage point from 2014 to 2020. A percentage point doesn't sound like much, but of course in the US, that's 3.5 million people. I mean, it's a lot of people. More children diagnosed with ADHD. So in a way, this has always been there. And yes, in a way, we are approaching a critical mass and we're noticing it more. I think there is certainly a higher level of diagnosis and recognition, especially among girls and women. A lot of the early diagnostic tools for ADHD, and the reason there's an H for hyperactivity in ADHD is because it was a tendency first diagnosed among like 9-year-old boys bouncing off the wall. Girls, little girls even, present attentional issues in a completely different way. That's gone undiagnosed or underdiagnosed, and the same applies to adult women. So there's certainly more diagnosis. The claims are trending higher. The pandemic has changed everything, including people's realization of their own, the way they're wired. But mostly, I think what we're seeing is an increased awareness and an increased willingness of neurodivergent individuals to self-identify, at least to identify to themselves, and potentially to identify to their employers, particularly as more and more neurodivergent opinion leaders step up, identify themselves as neurodivergent, and show that they're being successful as neurodivergent. So, maybe in my generation, we just, blamed it on ourselves, kept our nose, kept our head down and tried to get the work done. And now I think that there is an increased willingness to sort of say, hey, there's a reason for this, and dear employer, deal with it.
Yeah, and I think a bunch of these things are these things are coming together and compounding, right? There's the higher incidence of diagnosis, and the official stats are going up. That a lot of this is due to our shifting cultures in the workplaces, where we as ethics and compliance leaders, and hopefully our senior managers, care about these things and understand how this is not just a risk to our organization, right? We'll be talking about some of the regulatory enforcement and stuff like that around these issues, but this is just not a risk of finding out that we did something wrong. Engaging this properly, welcoming people of diverse mental processing abilities into our workplace, and giving them a place where they feel welcomed and where they know that they can succeed here, given the environment that they're in, is really becoming more and more prevalent, where people say, hey, you know what, this is not just something we need to do because the regulators said they should do it. That kind of compliance 1.0 legal defense state. This is not just kind of something that's good to do and moral, but this is something that if we do it well, we can build a better workplace, not just that we feel good about, but that performs better and helps us achieve our multifaceted mission better. And I think all of those things coming together end up, reinforcing themselves. And then people say, hey, you know what? That seems like that's a great place to work because people like me can succeed there. I could see myself there. Or they feel comfortable self-reporting because they know that they're going to be, welcomed and accommodated, not, put a ceiling on them and things like that. So I'm very hopeful about this. In some ways we might look at, hey, 20% of the workforce, and maybe this number is going up, and think that that's making things more complex. But I think that, that those numbers that we can track, or this incidence of us paying attention to it, is really a sign that we're getting this right, because these issues have been going on throughout all of humanity. It's not like dyslexia just popped up 20 years ago. And it's not like some of these attention deficit issues or something like that are new. We're just dealing with them in new ways. And to what Jason was saying, hopefully more and more of our organizations are making people not feel like they have to keep their head down and hide who they are. And more people are feeling like, hey, you know what? This is a place where people are going to value me and I can be successful here, and we can all build that together.
So I wanted to put out a poll maybe to all of the listeners here today, just trying to get a sense from you all who are listening, how much are you thinking about neurodivergence in your workforce? Maybe on a scale of 1 to 5. Are you aware of it, or does HR think about it? Does HR not really think about it? Are they aware of it but don't know what to do with it? Do they have a program? Just trying to get a sense of where on your radar screen this falls. So if listeners just want to pop in the attendee chat, like 1, we don't think about it, 5, the max, we're very strong on this. I just like to get a sense of where companies are. So we have some 1s, 2s, 3s. Okay, some 4s, but I mean, I'll be honest, this is on the lower end that, it seems to me that I am aware, but I don't know that HR is aware. Okay, that's a good response. They don't think about it. So Jason, give me some feedback on how you think companies are aware of this right now? Because we've got some 4s and 5s, but we have more 1s and 2s. Where is this on the priority list right now?
I think there's a disconnect from almost all companies. I think it is. I think this is still a low priority for most companies. I've really had a very interesting experience, Matt, talking about this issue over the last 2 years. It's probably the most resonant issue I've ever talked about. I mean, I've been, doing the compliance, go do webinar thing for 20 years now. I've never had a topic that was this resonant, where, and I have done something where I speak where I just say, look, don't say anything, don't reveal anything you don't want to reveal. But if neurodivergence has touched your life, you, a loved one, a coworker, raise your hand. Every time I do that, I get the same reaction, which is over the course of about 20 seconds, almost every hand in the room goes up. And then there's an audible gasp. And it's that gasp of, I'm not alone, or my son is not alone, or, my friend is not alone. And we're at that tipping point, which is also leading to this. So I get a lot of, wow, this is such a hugely important issue. And I don't get a lot of, and we're doing something about it. And we need to move to the doing something about it when you're talking about a quarter of the workforce.
Yep.
Yeah. And I think, I think there's some reason for that, right? If we're spinning up a compliance program or making sure that we're doing the essential things right, we're going to be keying on things that are clearly diagnosed and clearly regulated and clearly labeled. And part of the challenge and opportunity with this is there's a wide range of things. I love the mixing board analogy that people across your employee population are dealing with. But as someone said in the chat, if we can be neuro-friendly and make this a place where people feel like, hey, it's not shameful for me to say that, I think my brain works this way. And this is a place where I can be welcome. There's a lot of benefit to that. And to your point, Jason, I think that when we realize how prevalent this is, that can probably ratchet up the focus and expectations that we set of, even if, a regulator is going to come knocking on my door and make sure that this happens, or there's not a single best practice to do this. This is how we do inclusivity, guys. You have to figure out where it is in your population and engage in conversations and learn, just like you're learning on the Ethicsverse, how to take steps toward this. But, we hope that this is a step of forward progress in putting this, more toward the center of your radar so you can do things, because the way that, like it's coming up in the chat, the way that people interact with technology, the way that they interact with their teams, and maybe how much time they need to prepare an answer, or, how much they need to, have some time to unwind after a really stimulating event or something, are all things that we should say, hey, you know what? That's expected. There are a lot of people that do that, and that's fine. Let's work through that together instead of saying, hey, just do it on your own.
So let me shift gears a little bit to what some of these compliance risks are. And Jason, I want to start with maybe what I'll call the internal compliance risks, that you are mishandling a neurodivergent employee. And really, this is more in the realm of HR. We have some, I'll say, external compliance risks too. How do you get these neurodivergent workers to access your compliance program? We'll get to that later. But for right now, I just want to be thinking about what are these risks around, I'm going to guess, anti-discrimination, other issues. Somebody in the chat just now was saying that this is typically not something that comes up until someone discloses, but now there's privacy risk. There might be ostracization and retaliation potentially. So what are these HR risks that might come about from a clumsy handling of neurodivergent workers?
Sure. And let's put aside for later on talking about how we deliver our messages and whether they're engaging. Yep. I think first of all, there is a business risk of a missed opportunity. Whenever I hear business leaders talk about the tight labor market, we can't find people, nobody wants these jobs. And then you look at the unemployment rate among college-educated autistic individuals, and that unemployment rate is over 80%. In other words, less than 20% of college-educated autistic individuals are employed. There's a good solution for that labor crunch. and it's a risk that you're not taking advantage of that opportunity. But to answer the question more directly, there are certainly discrimination risks generally and specifically under the ADA. And the proof of that is if you look at claims to the EEOC, just EEOC level claims, over the last decade, there has been a steady uptick in claims that have a disability component. That's up over a third of all, or it's actually, you can't say a third, it's up over the high 30% of claims. You can't make it of 100 because obviously there's some claimants to the EEOC who are claiming under multiple rubrics. But there's a steady increase with a bump during the COVID years, but still staying very high of discrimination claims based on disability. And some of that has to track back to me to neurodivergence and those kinds of claims. So how is that? Let's look at the ADA very simply and very quickly. And this is a whole topic on its own, right? So the ADA says you are entitled to protection under the ADA. That is no discrimination and the availability of reasonable accommodations if you are disabled. Disabled is defined as you are substantially affected in a major life activity. Well, major life activities under the law include things like thinking and concentrating. And so the EEOC has recognized, for example, that autism is virtually always substantially affecting a major life activity of thinking. Autism happens to be the only neurodivergent trait that the EEOC specifically tracks so far. Gio, to your point earlier, they do track anxiety, and anxiety is ramped up over the years very consistently. And I would say probably some of that anxiety is a comorbidity, a linked condition to people dealing with neurodivergence. The causality may want to run in either direction, but I think it's not a bad analog. The point is, if I have an attentional issue, if I have a reading issue, if I have autistic traits, dyslexia, etc., then I'm very likely limited in a major life activity, and therefore I am entitled to the protections and the features of the Americans with Disabilities Act. And of course, the state statutes that are analog, which in many states, including my own here in New Jersey, may be even stronger than the ADA. So if that applies, that employee is entitled to, when they present that they need some kind of accommodation, they're entitled to enter into a constructive dialogue with the employer about what that accommodation might look like and what would be reasonable. And the employer is required to give reasonable accommodations if with those accommodations, the employee can perform the essential functions of the job. Remember that the employee does not need to specifically use magic words. They don't need to come to you and say, I believe that I am substantially limited in a major life activity and I'm entitled to a reasonable accommodation. Let's begin a reasonable dialogue. They only need to say things like, hey, I'm really having a hard time with how noisy it is in this hotel environment that we've created, this big workroom. Is there somewhere I can work that's quieter? In the compliance world, we would call that a request for a reasonable accommodation, and we should hear that as triggering all the protections and risks of the ADA. There's another whole category of risk under the ADA that I'll mention quickly, Matt, which is the regarded as feature. So under the ADA, it is discriminatory if I perceive you to be disabled, and because of that perception, true or not, you have some negative job, something negative happens in a job decision. So for example, you always seem to want the quiet room, and maybe you're not great at eye contact, and because of that, I decide not to promote you into this management position that's opened up, even though you're performing great in other traits, because I've made an assumption that you are neurodivergent and that neurodivergence keeps you from moving into management. Guess what? That's regarded as discrimination, and there's a good failure to promote claim there, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, and I think we need to come at this from a few different angles, right? There's the ADA reasonable accommodation that, when someone asks for it, you need to take action. But there's also so much that we can do in the way that we word our policies, the way that we distribute communication, the way that we invite people to. The way that I see it is, as you make this a more inclusive environment, you're inviting people to tell you what they need so they can contribute to your culture and your mission better. And we should be doing that. There's a comment in the chat here that's great that, is saying, too many companies are not changing their very narrow definition of what success looks like. And, we need to open up our eyes and say, hey, you know what? Someone can probably contribute if they have, they need some different breaks, or they need a quiet room, as Jason said, or whatever. But if we keep this very strict, standard, classical definition of only these type of people can succeed, not only are you putting yourself at risk, which is obviously super, super important, and you need to make sure at a minimum you're doing that, but you're also missing a huge opportunity to attract and retain talent who can not, just be someone who you need to work around, but be someone who you can work with and can support the success of your organization while providing a great work home for them.
Jason, here's a good question from Katie, who's asking, for things such as dyslexia, would you just accept the diagnosis or the statement from the employee, or would you want to follow the same process of obtaining a doctor's note or some sort of verified documentation that, yes, this person has a condition under the ADA, which, the D is for disability. So are they looking for documentation of a disability, or how would you recommend companies think through that process?
I think companies certainly have the option, and the law gives you the option to decide, hey, we would like some independent corroboration. Like, I understand what you're telling me, but we would like to know more. Do you have a diagnosis? Do you have a doctor's report? Is there any other detail you can provide us? Now, if you do that, then you have to be careful about, you're in possession of confidential health information. Are you keeping that in a separate file from your usual HR file? Not everybody can see it. Who's allowed to see it? You need to have protocols and processes about that confidentiality and about that information handling if you decide to ask for that kind of corroboration. To me, I think you may particularly want more corroboration if you're looking at an accommodation that really is a big difference, that's really something different than what you would normally could do, that maybe imposes a decent cost on the company. Then I can say, all right, it's worth going through that effort. I think if you take the position, as I would recommend, if you follow a best practice of, hey, we need to create multiple ways for people to get the information they need. Maybe we want to have some options in terms of what your working environment are. People are going to pick the one they want to pick. They're going to move around freely. We shouldn't make assumptions about the fact that you picked the quiet room today and what that means. Maybe maybe next week you don't take the quiet room. As an example. And, all this depends on the size of the employer, depends on the work environment. I'm using these as examples. My point is, there's a level which is really an accommodation, and I've really got to make some changes, and maybe I need to have a verification there, and I don't want this to be rampant within the organization. And then there's a level of sort of like, well, why don't we just do it? And again, I come to the watchword of good for all, critical for some. Curb cuts we created because the ADA required them, and we thought of them as like, okay, well, for the relatively small percentage of our workforce that is using a wheelchair, that'll be great. And then we discovered, oh yeah, that's also good for my baby stroller, or for when I'm pulling my rolling bag from the airport. And I go straight to work. That curb cut's pretty great. It was critical for some, but good for all. So if we're talking about accommodations, I'm making air quotes, accommodations for neurodivergence that are like curb cuts, well then, are they accommodations, or are they just the way we're going to do things around here, which is my favorite definition of culture, to get to the culture part of our topic.
Well, I did have one related question. I should have maybe asked this earlier, but Katie's point about how you diagnose this brings it up. I think that most people, if you just said, picture somebody with autism, they would probably think of that movie Rain Man and Dustin Hoffman portraying an extremely autistic person with hand gestures and poor eye contact and all that. But I'm just wondering, how often is that really the case? We have an extended family member in my own household, a boy who is mildly autistic. He has no problem making eye contact. He doesn't do the hand gestures. And a lot of people would not necessarily know unless they were trained to, oh, yes, he does have autistic qualities. So I do wonder, is there somewhat of a slippery slope here of mildly neurodivergent people where it gets very blurry about, is somebody just being an office jerk? Is somebody actually divergent, but it's hard to understand that? Do we default to these extreme stereotypes that don't actually exist for many people in the real world? Could you unpack a couple of those issues for us while we're on the subject?
Yeah, and I think to me, Matt, the number one peril is making assumptions.
Yep.
Jason, I think we're losing you a little bit. Jason, I'm going to give you a second to maybe let your Wi-Fi restore a little bit. Yeah. So on that, Matt, I think it's a good question, and I think it's something that we need to think about. And I would just start by saying we can't be driven to build our cultures out of an attitude of fear. We can't fear that one person is going to be the office jerk, and therefore we dial this back and not help all the people who reasonably, seriously could use some accommodation or some support in order to be really successful. So yeah, I think you can look out for those things. You can train people about it. You can, have some approaches that say, here's how we're going to evaluate these things. But, to the curb cut analogy or reference that Jason was making, there, you could look at this neurodivergence topic and say, hey, it's got a bunch of fuzzy edges and a bunch of people might try to engage with this disingenuously. Well, we're only going to do the really clear things. Or you can look at those fuzzy edges as a really high option for ROI on doing some of these things, of having an employee resource group, talking to some people, getting conversations going, giving your manager support on how to handle these things. Because of those fuzzy edges, you could be helping and improving the lives and the productivity and the engagement of scores of people across your organization. And I think that we have to start by looking at the overall impact and the overall benefit and the overall reach of this. And I think when you do that, I'm very convinced that we're going to see a massive shift over, this generation of leadership over the next decade, of people realizing that it's absolutely in our best interest to support this diversity of ways that minds work. And, the risk of someone on the edge, costing the company some extra money by trying to game the system or whatever, pales massively in comparison to the huge benefit we're going to get by not just helping people be more productive, not just attracting better talent, and not even just like driving retention, right? Those are some things you can put in your ROI calculation. You can get buy-in from your HR team and from your managers. Everyone's interested in those things, but also just in making our culture more inclusive, in a place where more people feel and know that they can be successful. That's where the benefit is for the ENC team to be at the table in the executive conversations, driving culture and driving a culture of ethics and compliance closer to the center of our strategy. And I think we have to look at this as a huge opportunity, not something that, hey, you know what, these fuzzy edges have more risk on them. The ethics and compliance leaders of the future, the people that are going to be vaulted into strategic, executive positions, are the people who see and believe and can communicate the benefits of these things that are so impactful, that if you just, close your aperture and myopically look at just that risk of regulatory enforcement or people gaming the system, you're going to miss so much benefit to be a blessing to people in your workplace and to drive your own culture forward. Jason, feel free to jump in. It seems like you're coming through more consistently now.
And it's us compliance professionals who, this is a familiar place for us to be in, and to spread these conversations about this topic. And sorry about the Wi-Fi issue. What I was going to say, Gio, is the problem begins with assumptions, right? The problem begins with, I think this condition looks like this, I think, and there are a lot of HR and management truisms that are just totally wrong when you begin to think about neurodivergence. It's like, oh, well, they go, I'm looking for you to make eye contact. If you don't make eye contact, I don't think you're paying attention to me. Well, I know neurodivergent individuals who, if they make eye contact with you, they won't hear what you're saying because the visual input is so strong that they lose audio. And so they've learned to look away to pay better attention to what you're saying. So if you make the assumption, oh, you weren't paying attention to me because you weren't looking at me, now a lot of those individuals have learned to stare here. So you think they're establishing eye contact, but in fact, they're not.
Mm-hmm.
But,
they're looking at your third eye.
Right. We don't need to enforce that, right? We just need to dump the assumption of what it means that you were looking behind me when I was speaking to you about something important, or, what I think a flat affect means. And this, let me say, Gio, I think we're in a collision course in another dimension here, which is as we increasingly rely on computers and AI and mass tools like, oh, everyone who applies is going to go through this assessment. We're going to do a personality profile on them. That is at odds with, we are not going to make assumptions about how people present until we get to know them better and we know more about what they're capable of doing and who they're really like. Because, for instance, if we run you through a tool that is measuring how quickly you make a forced choice, which I know is what a lot of the personality profiles do that you hit as an employee when you're screening for a new job. And it goes like, oh, well, he took too long to make that choice. I think that is potentially discriminatory against some neurodivergences. And there's actually a very interesting case pending in California making exactly that argument.
Some case law coming up for us. Yeah, and I think it's really important to, like so many things in your compliance program, there are going to be some core things that you're doing all the time, right? You're going to have your pillars set up. You're going to have your reporting, your policies and things like that. The way to advance your effectiveness is to start stepping into these things, right? We've talked about things on the Ethicsverse, around how you report to management or how you deal with AI and all those kind of things. We need to step into those things. And there's a lot of power and a very little investment in cost to talking about these things, to talking with managers and saying, hey, as you're doing recruiting, understand that your standards should be about production and delivery of value, not the things that you infer might drive that, right? To the eye contact thing. There are a lot of wonderfully intelligent, brilliant, engaged people that work for our organization here at Ethico, and they were kids that in high school, they just weren't good at taking tests. I'll tell you directly that it's not that they're not smart, just that if you just narrow it down to can they take a timed test quickly, then you're going to not only miss out on getting them as part of your organization, getting their genius as part of your team, but also you're setting yourself up for some of these other risks. And the point is just talking about it, just having a conversation during onboarding or having something in your policies that say we consider neurodivergence a strength and something that, we welcome here and drive engagement with, can just open it up for someone to say, okay, no one really said anything about it before and I was hiding. At least here somebody knows about this topic and has some empathy for what I go through. And you know what? Maybe this is somewhere where I can put my heart into my work.
Yeah, and this is an area, and I'm seeing this in the chat too, this is an area where one of the steps is just sort of raising awareness and consciousness, being aware of the assumptions you may be making as a manager that you shouldn't make, being aware of the range of neurodivergence and how it may or may not present. That's the kind of thing we can workshop around. It's the kind of thing that we can potentially train around. These are the kinds of things that my companies have been working on. But a lot of, in a way, this is compliance and ethics blocking and tackling, and we need to apply what we know to do to a new topic.
Jason, let me shift gears to one other issue I wanted to get at, which is how to make the compliance program or the company's policies and procedures generally, how to make them accessible to neurodivergent people. Because if you had 20% of the workforce who didn't speak English, and that was the only language for your anti-corruption training, everybody would be freaking out. The chat box would be lit up and the Justice Department would be online too. We all know that is clearly unacceptable because that's an easy example of what accessibility looks like. So how should we be thinking about how to assure that the policies, the procedures, the internal reporting hotlines, and other systems like that, that they are accessible to neurodivergent workers? Is it a real issue? If it is, how do we try to solve it?
I think it is a real issue. I think it's a big issue, and I think your analogy is a good one. I mean, we're in the business of saying, look, there are things all employees need to know, right? Mm-hmm. Anyone who works here needs to know this is inbounds, this isn't inbounds. These are the things that reinforce our culture, these things that don't. This is our code of conduct. These are our core values. But if we always are delivering those messages in let's say, our policies are all in this book, and it's all text, and every policy is 10 pages long, and it's, there are no pictures. This is the only way you can absorb those policies. Or, yes, we have this training. It's 2 hours long. It's e-learning, and there's voiceover along that you can't turn on or off, along with closed captioning that you can't turn on or off. We already know. We've known for a long time those are maybe not the best ways to train. Neurodivergence is the filter through which we can say, oh, now I see why it's not the best way to train. And this goes beyond what used to be the old trope of different learning styles, right? If I have a reading issue and the only way I get that information is by reading, I'm not going to get the information very well. If I have, an attentional issue and the only way to get that information is by sitting still and staring at a screen for more than an hour, I'm not going to get that information very well. So we need to be following what we know to be best practices. We need to be offering key information in a variety of means that we allow our learners to choose from. Some of this goes to things like, what are the equivalencies in our LMS? And is that respectful of people's ability to maybe get the information down another channel? It comes to things like, are we really following the principles of what's called universal design in our courseware, right? How, in our PowerPoints, right? How's the contrast? How's the font size? Are we being respectful about the fonts we choose? There are, there's a lot out there about universal design. That is one step, and it's an initial step. Mm-hmm. I think.
Yeah, and I think that we as leaders need to decide how we can take one of those steps forward. I think it's a great point that you bring up, Jason, that, a bunch of the things that we've been struggling against over the past decade of people don't want to do the training, and obviously no one read these policies and things. This might be the issue. This might be why 20 to 60% of your workforce is not engaging with that. And I think that if you want to take a step forward, listen, this journey is, you're going to be going on this journey for, this should always be a staple in your program. So maybe just pick a couple of these knobs on the mixing board and figure out how you can give a little bit more consideration for that next year, right? Look at, attention, look at reading, look at time management, look at deadlines, pick a couple of these things and say, hey, we're going to try to make this a little bit better. We're going to give people a little bit more of a deadline, or make sure they could read it or transcribe, listen to a transcription or something like that, and take a step forward. And what's really hopeful for me is, you don't need to triple your compliance team to have 3 different training, modules or something. We have technology now, and technology is advancing to allow you to scale and personalize this. And what that should be is not just some cool sales tactic that someone tells you when you're in an RFP, but you should be looking at that and saying, okay, I know you're talking about those features on your platform. That would be really great for our dyslexic population. That would be really great for somebody that needs things in bite size and can't sit through 2 hours of training, and just take a step forward on it.
Yeah, and you have speculated on something that I have also wondered about, Gio, which is, all the years I've been going to these conferences and having these conversations, and you hear, companies with really advanced programs sort of saying, we're measuring engagement and we're plateaued, right? We're plateaued. Mm-hmm. Maybe you drove it up into the 80% of engagement, but we can't, no matter what we do, we can't seem to get beyond that.
Maybe classic plateau problem.
Right. Maybe this is why, because you have a percentage of your population that the way they are wired, they are simply not going to be able to engage with that content. But when we're talking about compliance content, how we don't break the law. We can't accept 80%. We can't accept that there's 20 or 25% or more of the population that cannot. It's not that they don't want to get the message. They cannot get the message. I mean, what's the primary rule of communications? Know your audience. Reach your audience where they are, right? Hey, quarter of your audience is going to take information differently. You're going to meet your audience where they are, or are you going to blame something else and simply put up with 75%? In compliance, we can't put up with 75%.
Exactly.
We have about 10 minutes left, so I want to get to one or two questions from the audience here. Here's a good one from Kasturi. In your experience, what has helped to change subconscious bias toward neurodivergence among people in corporate organizations, both at the lower level and at the leadership level? What are the everyday small things that could make a difference over time? Jason, what would you think?
Like anything else, if you can find a way to have the conversation about it, the one-on-ones, the workshops, the tabletop exercises, to sort of say, are you making an assumption here? I always think that that's the most effective. It may not be, it may be a little harder to scale. It may not be a sort of like, well, I throw this course at everybody and suddenly the problem's all well. That's kind of not how it works. But I think for a lot of people, it is having an unthreatening conversation about, hey, were you making this assumption? Mm-hmm. For instance, that little story I told about, they're paying attention when they're not looking at you. And this is there's a scientific reason why they may not be looking at you and they're paying better attention because they're not looking at you. And often that story comes from, I know that one from personal experience from a loved one, right? When I tell that story though, there's always this, there's often this sort of moment of realization. It's like, people are like, yeah, wow, I have been doing that. And as I've learned more about it, I've thought of times when I, as a manager, completely mishandled the situation because I was, I failed to realize the realm of what was possibly going on. If I want to be a better manager,
I think that's so essential. Sorry to interrupt, but I think that there are a bunch of different ways that you can step into this. I think there's so much power in just naming it. Like, how many times have you written or said the word neurodivergent in the past 6 months? If it's 0, then there are probably a bunch of people who, they just think that there's no hope in it. You can, like I've said this to my teams of like, hey, there are some people that I've worked with who are on this team and they don't do this the same way. And I'll tell you without naming them, that they still figure out a way to do a great job because we've figured out together how to do that. So just naming it and saying it and people saying, hey, you know what? Like, yeah, I am kind of like that. And there are probably some other people, I'm not alone. That's very easy. That's essentially free. There's other stuff that you could do. And how are you setting your standards? Giving your managers guidance and saying, hey, you know what? You guys should just be conscious of this. I'm not going to come around and, hand out fines to people based on this. But if you're giving someone feedback about something and you notice this thing, or you see that they're consistently late for meetings or, have trouble processing the written things you send to them, you should really figure out if this is a neurodivergence issue, because it might just not be disengagement and they don't care and they're not trying. Give them some guidance on how to do that. And there are things that we have in this middle manager toolkit, which I'm a big fan of, by the way, that you can drive those kind of things. Send something around, post something on Slack once a week or whatever, and highlight this as something that is okay and that we are going to work together with you on. Not, hey, anybody who wants to get labeled with this, come over here and we'll put you in a room. But just normalizing it is like has so much power. And I guarantee you, if you start doing that, you say, hey, once a month, I'm going to try to bring this up to somebody in something in my program, you'll probably find out over the next quarter or two that resonance coming back to you and someone saying, hey, thanks a lot for bringing that up. That really matters to me. And, I've figured out my own ways to solve around this. And then you get some tips on how other people could do that. But I appreciate you mentioning it. And then you can iterate that and roll that out to other people and say, hey, someone else solved this way. They had this written thing and we delivered it this other way. But you have to get going on this to understand how to do it, because it's going to be so different if you have, 600 employees that all work in one office, or you have 20,000 employees across 8 states or whatever it is. But stepping into it, naming it, it and getting that conversation going. It may not work its way into your strategic compliance roadmap until next year, but there are a bunch of things you can do that don't cost $10,000 in a new vendor to get going on this and start learning about it.
So,
and I exactly. I mean, just knowing that it's in your toolkit as a manager or as a compliance professional dealing with somebody who maybe, started to cross the line, and to just ask the question of, hey, we put out a piece of training about this, or I sent an email to everyone about this. For you, was that do you find that a successful way for me to convey information for you? How do you like to get what's the way that I can get information to you that you find most useful, right? There's nothing wrong with asking that question. Right? I don't think you're running a risk by asking the question, how can I communicate with you more successfully?
Yeah, Jason, to that point, there's one more question I wanted to sneak in here where somebody is writing in, what if you have an employee, they're struggling and they could use an accommodation, but they don't come forward and ask for anything? How do you bring up that subject, since I can't ask them if they need an accommodation? Number one, is that true? You can't just use the A word and ask about accommodations. But even if you can't, how would you try and broach that subject? What would you say? You have about 90 seconds or so here.
First of all, I think you can.
No pressure. Take your time if you need time, Jason. We'll adapt to whatever you need.
Hey, I'm an old radio guy. I can talk up to the post. It's no problem. First of all, I think you can have that conversation and use the accommodation word, or don't use the accommodation word, but to say things like, look, I'm seeing that things are not, that this isn't working for you. What would work? Is there a different way we could present information to you? Is there a different way we should be organizing things that will work for you? And actually, under the ADA, again, the employee does not need to use magic words to trigger the process. If the employer sees a reason why they think an accommodation is owed, the employer has to start the process and the constructive dialogue. So that's one approach. And I'll just throw out one other idea. I wonder whether in some cases this idea is reason to rethink the old idea of the performance improvement plan. And instead of thinking of the performance improvement plan as a road to termination, think of it as a way to actually help this employee improve. And if you sit down and say, I want to put you on an improvement plan, and you're not in trouble, right? It's just that we want you to be more successful. And let's talk about a plan that will help you be more successful. And then that creates a rubric to have that conversation.
All right. So we have about 2 more minutes. Gio, I don't know if you have any other thoughts about that particular point that we just asked, or if you have any other final closing thoughts, but we have covered a ton of information. I really like all of the comments from the audience today. Clearly, they're very engaged in this discussion too. And Jason, you gave us a ton to think about here. This has been a great session.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Matt, and thank you, Jason. I just, as we wrap up here, I want to thank everyone for engaging in the chat. This is a topic that's close to my heart and I think is essential, not just for us to build better compliance programs, but for us to do the thing that's so close to our heart, to have a positive impact on the world and to make the world a better workplace. There is a huge population of people that can benefit from some empathy, from some engagement, from naming this thing and helping them feel like they're not alone and they don't have to suffer in silence. And if that's something that you care about, then you're right at home here on the Ethicsverse with Ethico. And this is something that I really encourage you to pick up and figure out how you can take a step forward on it. You don't need to request a bunch of budget for it right now. You don't need to, tear down all of your training and redo it in 18 different iterations, but taking a step forward on this. So many of us have a loved one or personal experience or someone we work closely with who could benefit from some more engagement and empathy around this, regardless of whether it's the formal ADA reasonable accommodation or just being a human and working with somebody and helping them be more successful. I think that's in all of our best interest. And that's what I hope you figured out some ways to engage with and take a step forward with today. Matt and Jason, I really appreciate you being with us on the Ethicsverse. Bye-bye, all you ethic cuties out there. Shout out to Nick. Thanks for jumping in the chat, Nick. We love you. Mwah. Keep healing up. Keep sending the love toward Nick. And thanks for all the emojis, guys. I'm almost full right now. Thanks for being on the Ethicsverse. We'll see you next week.
Thank you.